In this episode, we will discuss the impacts of affirmative action being pulled and its effect on BIPOC college students.
This is The Hidden Critique, where we discuss art, race, and higher education at the intersection of an MFA. I'm Marlon Tobias, pronouns he, him.
And I'm Krystle Lemonias, pronouns she, her.
Welcome to our show.
So we are in the first school year after the Supreme Court's decision to strike down affirmative action. This has caused a lot of discussion. As a podcast centering on our educational experience, we thought it was critical to grapple with the effects of these changes ahead. This episode is the first of a three-part series where we will bring on guests from different fields to give their expertise on the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And to give a synopsis of affirmative action and how it came to be, I got this description from Britannica.com stating that affirmative action in the United States was an active effort to improve employment or educational opportunities for members of minority groups and for women. Affirmative action began as a government remedy to the effects of long-term standing discrimination against such groups and has consisted of policies, programs, and procedures that give limited preferences to minorities and women in job hiring, admissions to institutions of higher education, the awarding of government contracts, and other social benefits. So the typical criteria for affirmative action are race, disability, gender, ethnic origin, and age. Now, affirmative action was initiated by the Lyndon administration, President Lyndon Johnson. So this was 1963 through 1969 in order to improve opportunities for African Americans, while civil rights legislation was dismantling the legal basis for discrimination. The federal government began to institute affirmative action policies under the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and an executive order in 1965. So businesses receiving federal funds were prohibited from using aptitude tests and other criteria that tended to discriminate against African Americans. Affirmative action programs were monitored by the Office of Federal Contract Compliance and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. Subsequently, affirmative action was broadened to cover women and Native Americans, Hispanics, and other minorities, and was extended to colleges and universities and state and federal agencies. So what it seemed like was affirmative action started as something to help benefit Black people and women, but what it did was it opened up the doors of opportunity for people of different backgrounds, origins, orientations, and identities to ensure that they get equitable opportunities for upward mobility.
Absolutely. And, so I'm so curious as to hear your initial reactions to this, and I'd love to share mine as well. What were your first thoughts, Marlon, when you heard about what was going on and its, potential impact for students like us?
Yeah. So I'm not going to lie, my knee-jerk reaction was coming from the perspective of an HBCU graduate. So my first thought was, by this decision going into effect, this is the time for Black people to start collectively and aggressively investing in the institutions that were built as a response to the discriminatory practices from these schools that only admitted white men. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So my first real thoughts were, it's time for, the Black students to start going to these HBCUs and finding HBCUs to attend. Wealthy Black people and Black celebrities, it's time to, really heavily start investing, adopt an HBCU to start, funneling more money and resources into, and let's build upon the institutions that were already started to help elevate us and provide opportunities for us so that we're secured and we're okay. So that was the first thought. And then my second thought was more so an inquiry rather than a call to action. And what I wondered was how this decision will impact the regulation of implicit bias, right? Because studies still show a disparity in job callbacks based sometimes solely off of ethnic sounding names. There was an article that I found that specifically talks about how a recent study found that applicants with quote unquote Black sounding names still have 2.1% fewer chance of getting contacted. So if these practices are still occurring in the workforce, now with this Supreme Court decision, I wonder if this form of implicit bias will show up, or how will it show up in applications for university admissions?
Great point, Marlon. Adding to the thought about implicit bias, I wanted to consider a bit more individually how our individual friend groups are made up, how our networks look. If our personal friend groups are segregated, then I don't see how higher education can be any different without incentives for institutions to do better. I know personally, before grad school, before undergrad, my friend group was fairly limited to the predominantly Black community that I lived in. Pulling from an article that I found on the Washington Post called "3/4 of Whites Don't Have Any Non-White Friends," I'd like to share a snippet from that article. It says, let's consider the average white American and the average Black American. And let's say, for simplicity's sake, that each of them have 100 friends. If you were to break down their retrospective friend networks by race, they would look something like this. In a 100 friend group scenario, the average white person has 91 white friends, 1 Black, 1 Latino, 1 Asian, 1 mixed race, and 1 other race, and 1 friend of an unknown race. The average Black person, on the other hand, has 83 Black friends, 8 white friends, 2 Latino friends, 0 Asian friends, 3 mixed race friends, and 1 other race, and 4 friends of an unknown race. Now, I don't think that everyone looks like this. Again, it's an average. It's pulling from a research institute, which is linked in the article. But I think, at least looking at myself and maybe others looking at their experience, how diverse is our friend groups? How diverse are our networks? I read this article in thinking about how would the leaders in institutions such as the chairs, the deans of universities and faculty, how can individuals like these be responsible for fully supporting DEI if they have unconscious biases, if there is nothing really putting them, making them accountable to stay to this? And so I see where DEI is so important. I see where affirmative action is so important. And it's really unfortunate that, this is being pulled back, and as being something that's so useful for this particular issue and the growth and the support that people of color really need.
So we got a lot of questions, right? And I'll admit that some of my thoughts are based off of knee-jerk reactions. So today we'll be talking with Neudy. She works to support diverse college students at a large university in Florida. She has a lot of experience working in her field and has acquired a wealth of knowledge where she can provide keener insight on how the strike down of affirmative action will play out on college campuses. So let's bring her on. Hi, Neudy. Welcome to our show.
Good morning, Marlon. Good morning, Chris. How are you both doing today?
Good morning to you. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. So before we really get into the nitty gritty and all of the great questions that we have for you in regards to the impacts of affirmative action, because mental health is important, especially in living in this entrepreneur, artist, and activist, advocate lifestyle, we want to begin with a simple question, and that's Neldy, how's your heart?
My heart is full of hope today. My heart is doing well today. I can say that confidently, full of hope and enthusiasm.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. Chris, how about you? How is your heart today?
My heart is feeling ecstatic and I was also full of hope. I think there's a lot of good to come. How about you, Marlon?
My heart is feeling a little, it's kind of jittery, and maybe that's because we're recording in the morning right now, and
Yes.
usually record later in the day. But yeah, my heart is really jittery, excited, really to be amongst really you guys, and feeling really excited to really talk about these subject matters, but talk about it in a way that is informative to a lot of people. So, so yeah, maybe I'm just excited to really jump in.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So, Neldy, we really have Chris and I think we can both agree that a lot of our reactions or opinions to affirmative action may come with a little bit of a level of naivety, especially with how this impacts or how this is going to impact college students. But we also want to hear a little bit more about you and your background. So, really, what drove you to this work that you do?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And the naivete is more than normal, right? I think that whenever we hear any large impacts to policies, we hear the large impact, but we're only given a very small window to look through to fully understand it.
Yes.
And I think that's what drives me in my work is wanting to be deeply involved in the day-to-day with an intimate sense of knowledge around the student experience, giving my work as I would call myself a mid-manager in higher education.
Okay.
And I have recently been in that role for the past 8 years. The last 2 years, I ascended into a more directorship role, but I'm still a mid-manager, right? We all are when we really think about our lives. There's someone above us or someone below us, every step of the way. And when you sit in such a position, you have the privilege, if you do the work correctly, to connect with students on such a level that you are deeply and intimately aware of their day-to-day. And at times, their day-to-day includes their thoughts, their fears, their successes, aspirations, future hopes. You get to understand their journey. You get to understand where they hope to go and what pauses, if any, they've had to take. And in higher education, one of my observations has been prior to the recent ruling on affirmative action, my prior observation has been that education has been a gigantic step forward for communities that historically have not been able to really consider economic progress for themselves or their family members. For individuals that stood for many, many decades outside of the door of the ivory tower, right, of academia. And affirmative action really provided individuals an opportunity to say, you know, I'm going to knock on the door and I don't have to worry that I will never be open for me. I know that I'm going to be able to walk through and take space in the ivory tower. So the work that I do has always been driven by, if that door is not fully open, can I crack it open from the inside? right?
Mm-hmm.
For particular communities. How do I show up as a member of that community, right? I'm a first generation college student. I am an immigrant. I grew up in Yonkers, New York. I remember my mom wanting to become a citizen of the United States when I was in high school. And it wasn't for any of her personal gain. She just knew that she would have the opportunity to provide my sister and I a chance to apply for financial aid. That was her motivation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is very much an immigrant experience, to have that sense of aspirational capital for yourself and for your children. So as I grew up in an immigrant home, as I did become a US citizen when I was 15, applied to college, applied to financial aid, affirmative action wasn't in my purview, right? All I knew was that I had to get really good grades to get into college. It wasn't until much later in life, I would say probably around 2007, and I got to college in 2001. So in 2007, in between my first and second year of graduate school, while I was obtaining my master's degree in higher education administration, I began to understand and study the impacts of several higher education policies that have been put in place by the US government.
Mm-hmm.
And upon listening about affirmative action, I felt fortunate. I said, I don't know if that was my case, but I'm glad that that exists, and I felt that renewed sense of the United States and quote unquote America being the place of opportunity, the land of opportunity, which is what so many of us who immigrate to this country hear.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward to today, as I've navigated higher education for 16 years, as I have met students of all backgrounds and have had the privilege and pleasure of working predominantly with underrepresented students, given the work that I do, I am more aware now than ever of the positive and significant impact that a policy such as affirmative action has on the American higher education system. So to see that threatened and removed, it's really an implementation that to me is very strategic,
Mm-hmm.
of an additional structural barrier to keep marginalized communities and underrepresented individuals in higher education outside that door, and
Mm-hmm.
to create a fence in front of the ivory tower where now you have to consider, do I climb the fence? Do I crawl underneath the fence? How do I even get to the door? Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Metaphorically, the door is further away with
Yes.
this being in place. And it's something that we must consider from all angles. We also must understand that we recently have been living in an American society that has a huge, huge sense of American nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, for those of us that might be Black and brown, right,
Mm-hmm.
you might not look like the American national that the once majority of the country wants to put forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that when populations feel threatened, in the sense that we have been hearing for probably close to 10 years, that we as a country, as a nation, will eventually become a minority ruling nation.
Mm-hmm.
The people that have been in the majority for this long don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
And when they have the power to create or undo a policy that may allow us to obtain an education, and that not always an education, because the three of us know our degrees did not make us millionaires, right?
That is so true.
Right.
So
Right.
not even an
Mm-hmm.
education that is going to allow you to kind of sit back on a pedestal of wealth, but an education to give yourself an opportunity to break some generational curses an education that affords you an opportunity to leave a different type of legacy behind for your family and for those that come after you.
Absolutely.
That no longer is possible for some folks because an education threatens those that many times don't have an education, but still relish in the idea of remaining powerful and in control, right? So we have to understand affirmative action and its undoing as a strategic and systemic move to uphold structural barriers for Black and Brown folks in the United States of America.
Thank you for that, Neudy. No, I think that Marla and I had some thoughts, not as in depth as that, but really considering how the demographic of the United States and how nationalism and just how the majorities, what was once the majorities' wield of power, if you will, affects our daily experience in higher ed. Thinking from my perspective, I know, some of my response was really centered around what our personal networks look like in regards to Black individuals, how many people of color versus how many white people are in our network, and even more so importantly, how much interaction and how many friends do white people actually have in their network, and how does that implicit bias, and in some case bias that just plain is bias, that they have affects their actual work for those that are in higher ed. I wanted to hear your thoughts on my reaction. I know Marlon wanted to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important insight, right? When you're working with Black and Brown communities in higher education, and you yourself as a brown woman, for me, right? I think it's natural that we draw upon our own experiences to connect with students, right?
Yes.
In the day-to-day. And then we have to also be informed by the theoretical perspective, right? What does the research say? What does the data tell you about effectively supporting students of color in a higher education setting within the context of a predominantly white institution? Because HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions, HSIs, they have mirroring experiences, but the dynamics are different. So when you've been educated to work with college students and you've trained to work with college students, and then you begin to delve deeper into how to best support college students who are minorities, particularly Hispanic, Latinx, Black, Brown students, BIPOC students, you draw upon the research and the data because you want to get it right. And one of the theoretical perspectives that I draw upon is a sociologist who has done a lot of work in higher education named Dr. Tara Yoso out in California. And she developed this model called community cultural wealth. And I'm not going to go too deep into it because I know we don't have too much time as a group this morning. However, what she was able to identify is that the concept of capita, and when we think about capitalism historically, and in the way that it was created by a theorist, Bourdieu, was within the concept of capita as income, and capita as money that flows in and out, and capita on money that you generate for yourself and how you accumulate that gives you a sense of how much capita you have. However, in her work with Latino students, Latinx students, and researching what I think has been mistakenly identified as grit and resilience, two terms that I have a lot of contention with for a lot of reasons, and maybe we can do another episode about that.
Okay.
What she came across in tons of qualitative data in connecting with Latinx students in particular was that Black and Brown students possess a sense of community wealth, which is what you're getting to, when you're asking what does the network of a white individual look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Black and brown folks are trained from a very young age to navigate spaces that we don't belong in.
Mm-hmm.
More commonly, we call that code switching, right?
Mm, yes.
Yes.
Dr. Yoso calls that navigational capita.
Hmm.
Okay. I shared my story about my mom wanting me to have access to financial aid, right?
Yeah.
And at a very young age, really influencing this idea and value for a college education.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the three of us could agree that at some point we heard either our parents or a family member say, I want you to have more than what I had.
Yes.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Yoso calls that aspirational capita. Okay.
Mm.
And there's 5 forms of capita, but I'm going to get to the next one. So then we get into college, right? As Black and brown students. And we immediately realize if we went to a PWI, I had the privilege of going to a Hispanic Servant Institution, an HSI, but I worked at a PWI private Catholic university in the Northeast of this country.
Mm.
And I quickly saw the next aspect of capita that I want to highlight. And that is when a Black and brown student arrives at a predominantly white institution where anywhere 60 to 70% of the population is white. And if they're Black, the student is really just maybe encompassing 8%
Mm-hmm.
of the student population.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing they do is they go to the organization fair. They either look for a cultural club that reflects their ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
They look to an academic club that maybe is also ethnically based, like the Society of Black Engineers, for example. And they begin to socialize with those folks as a way of saying, I need to create my own community while I'm here, because I need to be around the folks that look like me, and I need to be around the folks that look like the people that raised me.
Yes.
And when Black and brown students are able to infiltrate those PW spaces by creating community and socializing in groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
Walking in a
Mm-hmm.
pack, sitting in the student center in the corner as a group. If the school has a cafeteria or food court, grabbing a quarter of that space where people that don't look like them know, this ain't for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's called social capita.
Okay.
Okay.
And what I'm telling you with these 3 forms of capita, aspiration, social capita, and navigational, is that we are very adept at networking.
Mm-hmm.
We work within our family units. We negotiate which college can we go to, right? What can we afford? We draw upon the aspirational capita of our familial network, which also mirrors the other sense of capita, which is familial capita, having your family cheer you on and pour into you and tell you every day that you belong there.
Mm-hmm.
When you're sitting in a classroom at a PWI and are getting microaggressed or imposter syndrome falls through,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have family that are cheering you on from behind. And that's familial capita. So we are so adept at networking because that was part of our formative training to survive in this country. Right?
So, curious, are you inferring that networking is different for white individuals?
Yeah, I'm going to get there. What I was going to say was, and the reason I'm providing context is we don't know who listens to this podcast.
Absolutely.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And And for me, one of my goals is that people just walk away thinking about something they never thought about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So contextually, I like to frame my response, which is when you are the majority
Mm-hmm.
and have been privileged to be the majority for over 500 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the color of your skin allows you to be that majority, because the color of your skin has allowed you and your folks to put structural systems in place so that people that have my color of skin or you and Marlon's color of skin can be in a certain situation of dependency, then you do automatically, I believe, develop an individualistic mindset. And that mindset tells you, yes, I'm going to network, but I don't need to network. Okay. Yes, I'm going to, but I don't need to. And then when you think about how most privileged white folks network in this country, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're doing it in spaces that are further away from us, like a golf course. When was the last time you went golfing, Chris?
Never. Not to say I would never, but I just have not. It's not been my thing.
Exactly. What about you, Marlon?
Same sentiments. I think the last time I was on a golf course was a mini golf course, and this was back in, I don't know, 2018. So it's been a while since I've seen a golf ball.
Mm-hmm. And if you reflect on any movie that you've seen, you know, any typical American movie where there's some kind of narrative of entrepreneurship or business or trailblazing, there's always a group of men that work together and they meet at the golf course on a Saturday morning, right? The decisions are made there. They go back to the office on Monday. So when you consider that, networking for them is not networking for us. Networking for us has been rooted, I believe, in the sociological concept that communities of color, we are a collectivist society.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This podcast is a reflection of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
Where we know historically, you know, I'm not speaking ill of anyone who's white. You know, I don't have any issues with an individual who is white. The facts are that Northern communities, nationally and globally, and when I say nationally, right, you think about the North as the hustle after the Civil War, right? That's where people immigrated because people had been free for a really long time. So you had jobs, right? So just think about the simple concept of having a job in the Northeast. You know, you get up, you go to work by yourself, you get to work, you sit in a cubicle by yourself. Now reflect on how the economy developed in the South, right? There were plantations, and even though there was a plantation owner who's white, he could not function without the collectivist contribution of the enslaved folks on the plantation. So nationally and globally, Northern communities, and when I say globally, I'm talking about Canada, United States, Europe, the society has been acculturated as an individualistic society. Why? Because those were the forerunners of pioneering, right? So one, like Christopher Columbus, one guy individually said, I'm going to go and navigate. He didn't realize he was going across the Atlantic. I know you all know that he thought he was going to the Indian Ocean, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right? But think about that individual mindset. Oh, yeah, you've been deemed to do that. Go ahead and represent that for our people individually, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that has been passed down. But when you consider the global South and the communities, I would say, you know, that have historically been colonized, we experience that as a collective. So we've been networking, and I'm not going to say we, I'm not going to include myself in this because I'm not a Black individual. I I don't identify as Black. I'm not African American. I can't tell you, if there's a deep African ancestry in my bloodline. I'm sure there is, because I am a product of colonization.
Mm-hmm.
But what I was going to say is Black individuals have been networking since enslavement, right? I mean, what is the best example of true networking for survival and for upward mobility than the Underground Railroad?
Truth. That's the same thing that came to mind.
Yeah.
The same thing that came to mind.
Right?
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I do think white individuals network, and I am friends with white individuals. I'm not outside of their sphere, right? Like the friendship may vary in depth or in type of connection that develops, but white individuals have friends. They do build community. What I'm inferring is that they do it for different reasons. And when we think about policy making, right? What better way to build community if you were part of a white mentality of nationalism and a white mentality of we must sustain our power. We must sustain how we have historically ruled this country, which has been through systems of oppression for people of color. Then let's get this networking going and undo this policy. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
I believe that the networking mentality is rooted again in individual gain versus collective movement.
That is the difference. Interesting. I've never thought of it fully, plainly, sussed out as how you've described that. I can resonate with that.
Yeah.
I'm Marlon. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, my and I call it kind of like a knee-jerk reaction, rooted in my experience as a HBCU student. So in my undergrad, I received my bachelor's at a HBCU. So when hearing about this decision, I quickly kind of had a call to action response as far as, okay, well, if this is happening, now is the time for Black people collectively to start investing in those institutions that were meant to counter or meant to counter or more as a created built as a response to these discriminatory practices, right? So my thoughts were it's time for Black people to start investing in collectively heavily investing in HBCUs, sending their kids to HBCUs. Maybe it's time for celebrities who maybe haven't gone to HBCUs to adopt to HBCU, and those celebrities who have gone to HBCUs to if they're not doing so already, to heavily invest in HBCUs. So what are your thoughts about that and how it maybe if that's a good idea, or if that ends up happening or playing out, how that will impact the student body and I guess the numbers too, and if that's even possible?
Yeah, I think that's a very sensical and very, I would say, intuitive response, right? But my answer is layered for many reasons. And I think that the idea of, well, if affirmative action is going to close the white door to the white Academy Tower, to the white ivory tower, then I'm just going to walk through the doors that I know were created for me, right?
Right.
And in the context of an HBCU, I would say that's an option, but it's not a fix, right? Because affirmative action is not just leaving Black and African Americans at the margin of a higher education opportunity, right? That's just a small population of the segment. So what do you do with the Indian American student whose parents came from India, in the late 80s? What do you do with a naturalized Ukrainian student who has just been in the country for a few years, given what's happening in Ukraine, and have become naturalized, meaning that they're in the process of U.S. citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with a Latino student who was not raised in a Black neighborhood, or a white student, Latino student that is white passing? It may not be accepted on a Black campus, right? So we have to think about affirmative action as opening the doors to many groups of people, right? But understandably so, Marlon, you went to an HBCU, so in your mind, it's like, okay, well, this is a natural path, or a more secure and less threatening path, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that was the case for Black high school students, I would say that the investment needs to happen at the level of financial infrastructure for HBCUs first.
Okay. Yeah. Could you speak more to that?
Yeah. When we think about historically how higher education is funded in this country, for most of the country, schooling funding happens through zoning, right?
Okay.
The level of taxes that you pay in your neighborhood dictate how much of that money goes to the source of education in your neighborhood: elementary school, middle school, high school, right? So when I was talking about systemic oppression and structural barriers to education, that's another one, right? If you grow up in a poor neighborhood that happens to be all minority based, Black, Brown, Latino, Filipino, Vietnamese, I mean, we don't have to talk about that, but think about New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, right? The same issues with the levees and the infrastructure that Blacks were facing in New Orleans. The largest minority population outside of Black individuals in New Orleans is Vietnamese. I believe so. Okay. I know it's an Asian community. If I misspoke, I apologize. But they were facing the same because they were already living in poorer neighborhoods, right? If you ever been to New Orleans and you gone to the Garden District, I mean, I believe one of the Saints football players, Drew Brees, his home is on that main street in the Garden District. If you take the St. Charles line on St. Charles Avenue, right? So when we saw people affected by Katrina on the news, we all knew what they all looked like. They all had one skin color in common, right? Why? Because their neighborhoods didn't have the economic infrastructure to sustain such a disaster, right? Because of something called zoning that happened, in the 50s and 60s as economic development was surging up again 20 years after the Great Depression. You see people entering the workforce. The economy is good. You make money, right? You start to look around. You no longer want to live in an apartment building. You want to go get yourself a house, and you think you have a good job and you can pay your mortgage. And then you're told, for XYZ reason, yes, you can buy a house, but not here, not in this neighborhood. And you're not really understanding the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is we want to retain the goods and the financial investments to this neighborhood for our people. Right? So they begin to zone neighborhoods and say, Blacks can take this piece of land. Whites will be here. In most American cities, that is typically divided by a railroad track, which divides the city to the west and to the east. I live in the city of Tampa. East Tampa is historically a Black neighborhood. West Tampa was historically a Latino neighborhood, mostly Cuban immigrants, right? But West Tampa borders two very up-and-coming neighborhoods here, Seminole Heights and Tampa Heights. Those neighborhoods over the last, I would say, easily 7 to 10 years have been significantly gentrified. Right? Significantly gentrified. And what gentrification does is, as you all know, it ups the rent value. And it moves Black and Brown people who also happen to be lower income out of their own neighborhoods, right?
Mhm.
So once the neighborhood is gentrified, then property taxes go up. The elementary school does really well. You can hire better teachers because you can pay people more. Students become prepared in a different way for middle school. They do well on standardized tests, right? It prepares them for the biggest standardized test, the SAT, which is also up for debate. Then they go to the high school that also has been invested in. And because that high school has been invested in, the colleges around the states or even around the country are very aware of the preparation that students receive at that high school. So now that particular student has access to applying for colleges, and their application is going to be reviewed a little bit more carefully because they went to a high school that is historically known or even recently known to be a really good quote unquote high school. And what makes a good high school? Good financial resources, good teachers that get paid not below the poverty line, a building that is maintained so that when you walk in, you know, it doesn't feel like a prison, but you're actually in school, you're there to get an education. And if lunch is an issue for you, there's resources to feed you so that your brain can function properly and you can succeed. Right? Those are, to me, those are the components of a good high school. Right? So that is how higher education is funded. It's in the same model, right? If my college doesn't have an endowment like the Ivy Leagues have, I hope at least that my college has been situated historically in a place where property taxes and there's a community investment towards that infrastructure of education, right? And you see this at the flagship institutions across every state in the country. Your FSUs, right? Your UFs. If you're in the North, University of Virginia, right? You think about the North Carolina system, the UNCs, right? The primary UNC Chapel Hill. Think about where those schools are located in the suburbs, surrounded by these communities of people. So they have that infrastructure. When you think about the HBCU experience, just think about where HBCUs are located. Usually, if they're in the South, they are off in the outskirts away from a city, right? Typically, if you're in the South, what would be considered country land, you know, the lowland. And then if you are in the Northeast specifically, and you go to an HBCU, you're in the middle of the city, the middle of the hustle and bustle, right? Where the primary income for that structure of the city is capitalism, is business. Business comes, business goes, right? You don't have that sense of being able to draw up on the income tax or property tax that's feeding that particular neighborhood.
Okay.
So because higher education is funded in such a way where the income around the university dictates how much money the university gets, we have to consider, and when I talk about property tax, that's income, that's money. The more expensive your houses are, the more property tax you pay. Property taxes are then routed to education systems in this country.
Okay.
Right? And then you have a subsidy from the state. In some cases, like in the state of Florida, we are state funded by the government, right? In New York, higher education is state funded, but it's state funded through a more social services perspective. So for example, in New York, if your parents right now currently, I believe, make less than $100,000, you go to any state university system for free.
In New York?
In New York, it's just guaranteed, right? Because New York has that collectivist mindset of investing in education. Right?
Okay.
But then I want you to tell me how many HBCUs are in the state of New York.
Not many. They're very dense down south.
Okay, there you go, right? So going back to your point, Marlon, I know that I gave you kind of like a ring around the rosy response. My first issue is if HBCUs have the opportunity, right, through endowments, to have the financial infrastructure to sustain increased enrollment for Black students at the face of affirmative action not existing, then yes, that is a path forward. But if we look at the realities of budget cuts, of threats of not funding HBCUs because they might not meet a standard of review, right? By these boards of reviews, right? If you think about it too, look at this. There's something called the AAU, right? It's a very prestigious designation giving to certain universities.
What's that stand for?
I'm embarrassed to tell you that I don't know the acronym off the top of my head, most likely because it's before 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. And I don't
no problem.
I don't want to look it up.
Yeah.
I know I believe it's the Association of American Universities, you know, AAU, Association of American Universities, but it's not so much what it stands for, but it's what it represents. It's a privileged designation. And the AAU is amazing. You know, there's a reason why it affords a lot of opportunity. It puts your university on the spotlight for donors, for funding, and attracts more students. You get listed in so many, your top 10, whatever college program, your top 50 class ranking standing. It just affords you a spotlight in a way to attract students in a very strategic type of student that can afford to go to your university, right?
Okay.
So when you look at that, I want you to see how many HBCUs are listed as part of the AAU, right? And the connection that I'm trying to make is if a higher education institution doesn't have the proper funding, doesn't have the financial infrastructure to sustain itself now, and many HBCUs are facing that, you know, then how do you sustain the students that want to enroll there? So if you're going from 10,000 to potentially 20,000 over the next 10 years, students, from 10,000 students to 20,000 students in the next 10 years, due to the consequence of affirmative action, right? Black students say, I don't need affirmative action. I'm just going to go to an HBCU. And enrollment skyrockets. Simple infrastructure questions. Do you have money to build more classrooms?
Oh boy.
Do you have money to build more parking?
True.
Do you have money to hire more professors? If it's a residential campus, do you have money to update the residential facilities, right?
Right.
Do you have the ability to afford scholarships at the same level for students? Where's that money coming from? Or do you accept them all and say, well, let's enroll them all because that's going to increase our tuition dollars, and then pour that money back out into the university? Well, how long does it take to do that? And what do you do with the masses year to year? That's why I started talking about funding before answering this question, because if you don't have the money, you can't do it.
Right.
But I couldn't just say that, because then people are like, what is she talking about? I went to my HBCU and my HBCU is great. Yes, I'm not saying that HBCUs aren't. But once you're in higher education and you look at funding and you look at public policies on tuition dollars and funding and state government funds, some institutions in this country are funded directly through the lottery system of their state.
Wow.
So let's think about it, the issue at hand. Yes, affirmative action is on one end threatening opportunities. But on the other end, we must be able to acknowledge that this country doesn't invest in higher education at a monetary level in the way that you think it would,
Right.
given how long of a history higher education has in this country.
So
Exactly.
it sounds like if Black students decide to go to HBCUs in droves, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost sounds like it will be potential for clogging the system a little bit.
Clogging, and I would say crippling too. You know? And then what happens is it creates a pipeline and a causal effect. For example, I'm going to use my familiarity with HBCUs is based in Atlanta. And it's a very distant familiarity only because while in graduate school, I dated someone that went to Morris Brown in Atlanta.
Okay.
And Morris Brown, which I believe at one point they lost their accreditation.
Right.
I don't know if they're back.
They're just getting it back. They're just getting it back. So,
Exactly.
And it's a slow process.
Oh, it's so slow because I dated this person in 2006. And I remember them telling me that they were like, well, if they lose accreditation, is my degree going to be valued? Like, I don't understand what that means, right? Like, obviously a natural fear. So when you think about Morris Brown, right, and you think about Atlanta, then you think about Clark Atlanta University, then you think about Morehouse. And when I say those three, and again, I am not Black and I'm not speaking on this experience. I've never even been to those campuses. I'm just telling you from the peripheral what I know. When you name those three institutions, the landmark, well-known institution that is the HBCU of Atlanta for men is Morehouse, right?
Yeah.
Same thing when you think about women. What is the flagship HBCU in Atlanta for women? Spelman, exactly, right? So Morehouse at the same level. So let's say that Morris Brown has accreditation right now, right? And with the effects of affirmative action, like we mentioned, Black students say, I'm just going to go to HBCU, and all Black students in the state of Georgia decide to enroll at Morris Brown, at Clark Atlanta, and at Morehouse, right? The men. And then in 2 years, as a Black male student, I'm at Morris Brown, and I'm dissatisfied. I am in a classroom of 300 students. Let's say, I don't even know what their enrollment is for biology. I can't really ask a question, but I'm confused. I have to wake up 30 minutes early because parking is a mess and I don't want to be late for class. I can't get a job on campus, but it seems like everybody else has a job on campus, right? And after 2 years there, I say, I'm just going to go down the road to Morehouse because my friend that goes to Morehouse, when he takes bio, he's in a class of 30 people and lab is only 15. And he doesn't have one teaching assistant, he has 3 plus his professor. And he's never complained about parking to me. And he's had a job on campus since he was a freshman. You see the point that I'm trying to make? Yeah. Now I transfer there. If that pattern happens to come true, not only are we just increasing enrollment overall, but over time, I would say the HBCUs that have the financial resources and the solid infrastructure that I'm talking about, and in this example, in the South, Spelman and Morehouse, then now they're receiving the consequential transfers from other HBCUs that did not keep up with the student experience or providing the student services. So it creates, that's where the clogging happens, Marlon.
Okay.
But the crippling happens from within if the infrastructure is not there. And the crippling is you enroll freshman students, but you don't graduate as many seniors because halfway through they leave.
Right.
Wow.
And then the way that our higher education system manages enrollment, they don't base it on year to year. They say this freshman class, we're going to bring 17,000 students, for example. That's an exaggeration. But this freshman class, we're going to bring 6,000 students. So the university has budgeted services, programs, salaries for the 6,000 enrolled. Because we know there's attrition, meaning people are going to be leaving and you don't have to worry about that, or somebody may graduate in 3 years, right? Blah, blah, blah. So they base their funding on that first year enrollment.
Okay.
So if you're an HBCU like Morehouse, and you're basing enrollment on an expected 2,000 students entering the freshman class and continuing to 4 years, but now in 2 years of that budget, you have an influx of 1,000 juniors that transferred from similar or other HBCUs because you have the resources that they need. You didn't budget for that. right? So when we talk
Yes.
about higher education is an economic, you have to attribute an economic lens for it. From the
Right.
inside, because without the money, you can't run it. And from the outside, because without an education, you don't get the same opportunity for economic prosperity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's why I told you my answer is layered, and it's
Yeah.
for many reasons, right? So just in short, the first reason we can't just rely on HBCUs is because they don't have the financial infrastructure to support that. Right?
Wow.
The intent might be there.
Right.
The willingness to educate is there. The desire for enrollment is there.
But the infrastructure is
because
not.
Nationally, the Department of Education is not funding HBCUs, right? And
Right.
HBCUs are often not state universities. Here in Florida, we have 12, and only one is an HBCU, Florida A&M.
Wow.
I almost wish I would have started with that example, because guess what? Florida uses state funding based on performance-based metrics to fund their college system. Meaning, I want to know what percentage of freshmen go from freshman year to sophomore year. That's called persistence.
Okay.
Right? The governor of the state says, to get funding, you need to prove and show that 90% of your freshmen, these are actual facts because I'm in higher ed in Florida, 90% of your freshmen continue on to the sophomore year. You get a point for that. That says it is an allocated point system. Then they say, okay, that's your persistence rate. Now we're going to measure your graduation rate. I want you to tell me what percentage of freshmen graduate 4 years later, right? Uninterrupted enrollment from freshman year to senior year, 4 years down the line, they have a bachelor's degree. And then the state says, you must do that for X percentage of students. I don't want to say the figure because it shifts every year, but I think it's probably somewhere around 70%.
Okay.
Then they say, well, we know not everyone's going to graduate in 4 years, so we're going to give you another measure of success for graduation, and that's the 6-year graduation rate. I want you to tell me what percentage of freshmen without interrupted enrollment graduated in 6 years, right? You get a point for that if it meets our marker. You get a point for meeting our marker on persistence. You get a point in meeting our marker for 4-year graduation rate. You get a point in meeting our marker for 6-year graduation rate. And then I want you to tell me how many of your graduates continue straight from undergrad and enroll into a graduate program or enroll in full-time employment in the career of their major. And if you do that well, I'm going to give you a point for that. So in Florida, the 12 universities, the 11 state universities, and the 1 HBCU, which is a state university in Florida, Florida A&M, imagine getting put on a chalkboard, points get allocated, the ones with the most points get the most funding.
My God.
So let's go back to think about what I told you. What does A&M stand for?
Agricultural mechanical.
Okay. So when you think about the history of that, what individuals were working in those industries? Right?
Yeah.
So when you have a university that's A&M, regardless if it's an HBCU or not, A&M is the blue collar university in your state. How much money do blue collar alums have to donate back to their institution to build their endowment?
Truth. Wow.
So I hope that illustrated more succinctly how funding is inevitably and intricately connected to the opportunity that an HBCU could manage increased enrollment due to affirmative action. And in my opinion today, that's not the case across the country. Very few HBCUs can take that challenge on and do it really well. And not because it's an HBCU and it's Black higher education administrators or presidents running it. it's because historically HBCUs don't receive financial support from the US government.
Yeah.
So how do they sustain themselves? It's like it's like they're having to fly the plane while they build it every single year, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, as a HBCU alum, we definitely felt that as students. We felt that on a very surface level. It was very potent that was something that we had to face against as students, as administrators across the board. That was very potent in the air of my HBCU experience. And you are really again, Nelly, you are really breaking this down in such a way from the top to the very fine details, which I really appreciate. And that leads into my next question. And also, before leading into my next question, also thank you for providing that clarity to even just Chris and I's I would say maybe surface level opinions and really providing more context to how these things are broken down. But moving to the next question, given the shifting political landscape across many states nationally, I mean, we've seen a call to defund DEI efforts across the country. So now with the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, what do you foresee being lost as a result of this decision?
I just think that college is going to become harder. The college experience for BIPOC students is just becoming harder, right?
Yeah.
Why? So now affirmative action is not a thing, but that doesn't mean Black students and Latino students are not going to go to college, right? Like that's not what affirmative action is saying, because in this country, you literally cannot do that. That would be, you know, racial discrimination against college access, right? Like you can't do that. But what it does means is that the opportunity to enter college is more narrow now, right? So let's say you make it. So let's say affirmative action is out the window. You are a Latina student. I'm going to use me as an example. I make it and I go to a PWI. And remember I talked about social capital, right?
Right.
Yes.
Right. And let's say I'm having trouble finding the Latin American Student Association on my campus. I went to Target the day of the org fair and I didn't walk by their table. So I can't find them.
Okay.
And I know that there's an office that supports multicultural students. And I see myself as multicultural because if I'm not white, I'm multicultural, right? That's what we're told in this country, which is also very problematic. So I go to find this office and I'm told that office doesn't exist anymore, right? But that all of the organizations, including culturally based organizations, are now in the office that oversees general student programming and students getting involved on campus. So I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to go there. But I walk in there and I don't encounter anyone that looks like me. Right?
Yeah.
The person working the front desk doesn't look like me. Because all organizations are seen through this office, I also come across for the first time in my life as a Latina to Greek letters. They're all over the wall. I see pictures of community, of people that don't look anything like me. They seem happy, but no one in the picture looks like me. And while I'm having this confrontation that I'm in a space with people that don't look like me, I start to question, do they even know what the Latino American Student Association is in this office? Should I even ask the question, or am I going to sound stupid? Should I try to maybe connect with someone else?
So all these questions you from that space.
Exactly. Now I'm hyperly aware that I don't belong there. And if you walk into a place, think about it. Think about this very common thing that happens, not even in college, but in high school. First day of any of your high school years, you look at your schedule, You have math in room 302. You have that in your mind. You looked at it in the morning before you got to school. Math in room 302, math in room 302. You confident walking to 302 and they're teaching English. And you're like, oh, I'm in the wrong space. What do? You immediately feel embarrassed and walk out. Right. And then you look at your schedule and you're like, oh, it was room 203. How dumb of me. Right? That feeling that you get of not belonging, that is immediately coupled with frustration for yourself because you thought you were going to go into a space that you were going to belong, but you made the mistake. And then feelings of fear, right? And then fears of disillusionment. I was trying to find people that look like me and connect and socialize because it's in my being to draw upon social capital, to thrive and connect with others and succeed. And I don't know where to go. I don't know where to go to find my people. That is what defunding DEI looks like for a college student of color. You're literally taking away their spaces, right? And then DEI work is hard work, right? And the people that choose to do DEI often are drawing upon their own personal experiences to connect with students. Remember, that was another point that I made in the beginning.
Yes.
So when you defund DEI, don't call it defunding DEI. Call it what it is. Say we are no longer funding salaries for Black and brown people to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work for Black and brown students.
Wow.
That is what defunding DEI actually means. So if you are at PWI and you no longer have a DEI officer, right, who's checking your white faculty every time you're getting microaggressed based on your race, for example, or your gender, right? You no longer have an officer holding folks accountable to that behavior. You no longer have an officer creating policies to sustain safety. And psychological safety is what I'm talking about, and physical safety, right? You no longer have an office who has a potential of training police officers on your campus on how to interact with a Black and brown student. You no longer have a DEI officer putting policies in place that support the enrollment of Black and brown students, meaning if we have the lens of race and class and income intertwined as a DEI officer, and we know that students who happen to make more money, right, belong to higher social classes, which gives them access to resources such as preparing for the SAT. And now, because you belong to a higher social class, you don't have to work after school and you can study for the SAT and go to your SAT prep class, right? And you score higher on the SAT, then you have a guaranteed admission if it's a standardized based admissions program, standardized test-based admission program. The DEI officer at that school is the person saying at that enrollment management committee, hold up. Why are we basing this by SAT? Oh, well, we've always done that. Yeah, you've always done that. Because for always, before today, all your students looked the same. But today, our students look this way. And let me tell you something about a student who happens to be brown. They also happen to be poor in many cases. They also happen to be first gen, so nobody talked to them about the SAT prep course. And they also happen to have a job after school. So they couldn't go to the SAT prep, even if it was free at the community center. So because let me finish this point. So just because you have done it this way and it has worked for that population, it's not going to work for this population. So without a DEI officer challenging policies that create barriers to admission for students, not only is affirmative action leaving you outside the white door of academia, now you have policies from the inside that say, you can knock on the door right? Affirmative action was the door's open. Now the door is closed. So according to them, they're going to look at all these other measurements for admissions, which is really still the SAT. We know this.
Yes.
Right? And then you have somebody on the inside saying, but the SAT must be this.
Mm-hmm.
And if that person's a white individual, a white director of admissions, remember, implicit bias is real. They are setting that obviously on data, but oftentimes I've heard them mention their own children. Well, really, because my daughter, well, you're the director of admissions at one of the largest funded institutions in the state. Of course, your daughter did XYZ because you afforded her those opportunities, right?
Right.
So to answer your question, college is going to get harder for students of color. And my fear is that we are closing the pipeline and pathway for minority students in this country to obtain a higher education degree. That is what we're doing. We don't understand it that way because these things are supposedly happening in silos, right? But they're not. The same month that we were hearing about affirmative action, the SAT was being reviewed by the College Board. That same month, many governors in the country were putting up a legislation against DEI. Same month. So if you can just pretend that this is that game when you would connect the dots to make the shape, right? We don't have the writing on the wall. We have the entire picture. We have a Van Gogh on the wall of what they're trying to do to minorities in this country. And what they're trying to do is just funnel us directly into the workforce, making minimum wage.
Oh my God.
So that generationally and cyclically, we are under a system of financial dependency.
Wow.
And poverty. We know that the only way out of poverty is education.
Yes.
When these students say, oh, I'm not going to college because I'm an influencer. Okay. You made $100,000 this year as an influencer and you're 15 years old. That's great. But you happen to be a person of color in a poor neighborhood with poor parents who have never even managed $10,000 a year. And you are telling me that you're capable of managing $100,000? So great, you made the money, but we know that in this country, your income doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. It's how you use it.
It's how you use it and your ability to sustain your income.
Right.
So if you were an influencer because you learned how to do the Macarena backwards with an orange shirt on.
An orange.
And no other clothing manufacturer in the world produces an orange shirt again. Are you as popular now? Right? Education is the only thing that's not arbitrary for financial independence and economic prosperity. And I'm telling you this from personal experience. I came to this country from Venezuela when I was 7 years old. I always loved school. I grew up having an increased value for education because a lot of my family on my mother's side in Venezuela were either educated formally or they were entrepreneurs and still drop on education as a sense of opportunity for them, right? I grew up on welfare. I grew up where we would get evicted multiple times. I went to numerous elementary schools because we would get evicted and would have to move, right? So then my mom, because she didn't drive, would just move us to the school that was closest, either for the bus route or for us to walk there. We would get evicted because my parents couldn't pay rent on time. Sometimes I didn't have electricity at home. Sometimes I didn't have food to eat, right? But I never saw myself as poor, right? Which is the whole concept of capita in our communities. We always ate. You know, we were poor, but we were never hungry, is what I like to say.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I went to college in 2001. I got my undergraduate degree in 2005. I got my master's degree in 2008. I'm currently in a PhD program.
Mm-hmm.
I currently make about $91,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
My parents are still on welfare. My parents are on Section 8.
Mm-hmm.
My sister, who grew up just like me, makes over $150,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
We still have the same parents who are still on welfare, who are still on Section 8.
Mm-hmm.
What is the key difference between my sister and I and my parents?
Education.
We both went to college.
Yeah.
My dad is a contractor. His last contract that he solidified was for $26,000.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you're like, oh, one job, $26,000. Yeah. But my dad is not going to know how he's going to pay rent next year.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
My mom is a bus monitor.
Mm-hmm.
She makes minimum wage. In the summers, she doesn't know how she's going to pay her rent. Right? And I'm saying this very publicly, and I know you guys did my introduction and people know my name, and I love my parents. I'm not speaking down to them. They're blue-collar workers like many people in this country.
Yeah.
And they had an opportunity since they came to this country in 1991, potentially to go to college, but they couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
How could they have gone to college when they had to feed us?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Truth.
I asked my mom recently, Mom, how come once I entered high school, because my mom loves working with children, I said, why didn't you get a degree in early childhood education?
Mm-hmm.
She said, what does you being in high school have to do with me raising you? She said, just because you're in high school doesn't mean I needed to stop raising you. She said, I didn't go to college and I didn't get a job outside of the home. My mom was a babysitter for my entire childhood. She said, because I needed you to come home to a home-cooked meal and someone that would sit and do your homework with you. And that's what I had. Among the evictions and the light and all this stuff, electricity being shut off, my mom was always present.
Yeah.
And the sense of confidence that that gave me and that love and that belief in myself through my mother's love and dedication and care to me is what led me to get a college education.
Yeah. Yeah.
Coupled with the opportunity to receive financial aid, coupled probably with affirmative action.
Same.
Right?
Same.
But that infrastructure of love, home, support, dedication was there. So it's not that they didn't want to go to college. It's not that my parents weren't smart.
Yeah.
In Dominican Republic, your high school degree is almost like a bachelor's degree here. When you graduate, in many other islands, it's like that. When you graduate with a high school degree, there's a certification that you receive. That means that you have a bachelor's degree, the equivalency of that. My dad's degree is in calculus and physics. And he wanted to be an engineer. My mom, before she immigrated to this country, was studying to be an oncologist.
Wow. My God.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the American dream wasn't for them. It was for my sister and I.
Right. Right.
And we're living it now. We're living it now. Right. But the only way that I can guarantee that dream for my children is what? I had to pass the education value down to them. If my parents would have just brought us here and not cared for education and I was just working, not getting a degree, I know this for a fact, I would probably be making today maybe $50,000 a year. Maybe. And I would probably be making that in really hard physical labor that fortunately for me, I've never had to experience.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I'm making $50,000 a year, do you think I'm really thinking about one day paying for college for a child? Let's be real.
Yeah.
Or if I do, am I going to be able to pay for them to live on campus? Right? And get them a car if they go to like one of the rural Ivy Leagues in the country? No. So let's keep it real. Everyone who is smart understands that education is a pathway to economic prosperity, and financial progress, and social mobility. And for me, the emphasis on the SAT, along with affirmative action ruling, along with a call to defund DEI, is the strategic and very well thought out plan to ensure that minorities in this country have no opportunity for social mobility.
Yeah. This is a wealth of information that resonates highly with me. I have a similar journey with, as you, Neudy. And, but, in close, is there any hope? What can we do, or what can students do to circumvent this decision? I was thinking a lot about a document you shared with us in regards to DEI legislation and what's going on, the tracking of what's going on across the nation. In close, can you share with us your thoughts on what's going across the nation in regards to the legislation that is occurring, the bills that are being passed, and its effect on how do we move forward as students and individuals of color that are fighting to keep these opportunities alive for ourselves and our children and whoever else is, comes to this country to learn and grow.
Sure. If there's hope, yes, there's hope, right? And I'm not saying that just blindly, because I want to believe that there is, but there's hope because when you look at the legislation, the state legislations that are wanting to be passed, you're going to see that more bills were proposed than bills that were actually passed into law. Okay. Right? So that tells me that although the intent has been there at a lower level, once it moves through the state, individual state house and legislation system, there's people with common sense sitting at those tables saying, no, we're not going to do this, right? So it's encouraging to see that despite the many bills that have been introduced, not many have been passed. And even those that have been passed, not many have been signed into law. Remember that, right? Bills have a process.
Yes.
So connected to that, the only way to prevent these things to being signed into law is you need to be able to dictate who are your lawmakers, right? So the only way for you to dictate lawmakers is to vote, right? And it's not about voting for November election. We know this is an election year. That's what they call it. And that's also very strategic messaging. Every 2 years is an election year.
Right.
Yes.
Because the president's being elected has very, 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 very minimal influence on whether your city is going to get a new traffic light or not. So every 2 years is an election year because we should be voting on our county legislators, our state representatives, our state legislators, our senators. Those are the people that make the laws. The president doesn't get involved. We could have the most higher education, pro-affirmative action, anti-SAT, pro-DEI president sitting in the White House, and they can't do nothing about it because we are a state-by-state government system. So you need to get civically engaged with voting at the state level and at the county level. And if you're a young college student hearing this, DEI officers appreciate your advocacy for us. But you have more power than us. And yes, we need you to send that email to our vice presidents about the work that we do, right? Or publicly in a meeting mention how distraught you would be if our offices didn't exist. Thank you for that. And you are more powerful to us if you vote the right people who are going to keep the work in place. If you have any source of political incline, I encourage younger folks, whether you're recent college grads or you're in graduate school or you're in undergrad, if this moves you to the point of wanting to do something, why can't you be the one occupying a seat at the Supreme Court? So you have the aspiration to see yourself as the ultimate ruler over these policies, laws, practices. You can do that. Why not? Right?
Yes.
So I think my call to action is vote, become civically engaged with voting, get to know what your county votes for, who pulls the strings in the neighborhood that you live in, right?
Yeah.
Get engaged with the NAACP chapter of your city. If they're having a general open meeting for the community, go. Network. Talk to these folks. If you have the power to bring speakers onto your campus that are going to provide perspective in a way that highlights more than the little sliver we get on the news, bring them onto your campus. Share information. If you are educated, then you can be an educator. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I love that. Well, again, Neldy, thank you so much for coming on our show and providing your insight, your keen insight into this subject matter. And you just really provided so much clarity and a really great step-by-step breakdown of how this can play out, how this will play out, and how it can potentially play out. And I think that this is information that's really needed to be heard in the masses to really get an understanding of affirmative action. So thank you again for your time and for just being you and your work and your expertise as well.
Yes. Thank you so much, Neudy.
Thank you, both of you, for allowing me to be on your podcast, The Hidden Critique. So excited to get this message out there, and I really appreciate the opportunity you provided to provide a really well-rounded and almost bird's eye view of the higher education landscape in the United States. So thank you again, and I wish you much success with the podcast.
Thank you. Now we're at the point of the show where we want to hear from you, the listener. Join us on Discord, the link found in our show description, to share your thoughts on these two questions. 1, for current MFA students, at the onset of the Supreme Court decision, what shifts have you noticed in your campus culture? And 2, what campus organizations are you engaged in that provide a space to provide your opinions on those changes on your campus?
Thank you for listening to our episode. The Hidden Critique is produced and hosted by us, Krystle and Lemonias and Marlon Tobias. Episodes are edited by Kirsten Pettifor. Original music composed by Cesar Presa.
If you like the show, you can review and rate this podcast via Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can also like, subscribe, and comment on our YouTube page.
For exclusive bonus content, subscribe to our Patreon at The Hidden Critique.
Or join the Hidden Critiques Discord page to engage directly with us, the host, and build community with fellow listeners.